Alright then, sound checks. While we wait for the restream. Poke. And 1. And 2. And testing. Being very chill right now. Possibly because the boiler isn't working. Maybe. I'm clear. But I'm good at chilling. It's one of my favorite things to do. Cool. So sounds good. Waiting for restream. Good evening, everyone. Rillian and Amara returning with bot tune-up number 4. This content will be rebroadcast from the Amara2_MK channel to our main team's 2_MK channel with full permission. So last time I tried this, there were some technical difficulties that prevented me from finishing it, but today we're back with Amara herself playing against the bots we'll be reviewing today. And I'll start with Ed once again. The purpose of dealing with EdBot is to close in. Now, EdBot was covered by OmniRapid, so I'm not going to go into much here. But since I did initially intend to do it, let's take a look at it. See a little difference in terms of what was changed. Just to point out the difference for those of you who happen to watch that stream. Whereas OmniRapid gave him a crouching medium kick, and probably that's the best option. I put a crouching heavy punch in this one, in the same spacing. There's nothing too specific that needs to change about this bot. But there is a difference in the way that the bot behaves when under certain types of pressure and when certain types of defense are faced by the bot. Ryu and Lara are relatively similar in their ability to defend against Ed in certain spacings. But Ryu has some extra options that we often test bots on because of his ability to hit and stop a situation from happening and throw the bot's rhythm off in a different way. So there were 1 or 2 things I observed. If you are a character who's capable of stopping Ed from doing particular things, you may not have been able to see everything that can happen based only on the interactions that OmniRapid was having. Also, as you know, all bots have this slight difference based on who entered it. So until we have tool-assisted level bots, which is not all that far out of our scope, but we all play on PS4 and can't necessarily give them off to everyone even if we did make them. So a lot of our effort is on getting something that anyone can use. So what you're seeing here is Ed doing the V skill, sorry, the V trigger. And due to both Amara's character and her timing, he has a much stronger tendency to just do the move in neutral. This is something that happens a lot when you have characters with long range, zoning, other specialties like that. But Lara is much less likely to show this off, so I figured it was still relevant to most people to see this little bit. Now what exactly triggers Ed to do this can differ quite heavily. And if you're pushing to get in on Ed and throw him, depending on your character and when your own rhythm for it is, you see all sorts of different things. But you can see there he also combos into it fairly well. For characters who can buy themselves a lot of space this way, and then having bought themselves space, decide to go in at times when they think it's safe based on that space they have managed to buy themselves, and who variously don't have to worry about Ed's zoning as much due to either counter zoning or shifts in their own throw. I'm considering that the crouch heavy punch might be the better option, simply because it gives Ed the capacity to do certain things in neutral that are more helpful overall. But in any case, you've seen here that Ed can definitely do the V-trigger raw even if he doesn't do it that often. And it mostly depends on how much time you are spending getting in on him and how often you get hit by Psycho Upper, stuff like that. But there, that's exactly what I'm talking about. You'll note that sometimes a zoner has the capacity to hit Ed in a situation where Ed is close and staggers back, but they also have the capacity to hit Ed when he's far, and this will trigger the same thing. This has to do with the way that hit stun works on projectiles. So we're going to switch Ed over to V-trigger 2 with the version select now. And we're looking to see if the same behavior happens, and more accurately, what happens when it does. Because it might still not be helpful. One of the ways it becomes most important is because a zoner has the capacity to throw EX fireballs in response to Ed's spark in certain spacings. And doing so will cause EdBot to get hit, giving you the chance to get in. But as you can see right there, he basically used it on his own anyway, even before we got there. Knockdowns also cause the same sort of situation. The knockdowns caused by your character can be different, and through that, alter when Ed is likely to use this move. Whereas a grappler like Laura tends to have a fairly set way that she interacts with Ed, other characters with more variable things like this are much more likely to cause this bot some spacing issues and therefore get him to do random-ish moves. So far, however, it doesn't seem as if it's going particularly poorly in terms of when he happens to use it. He's likely to be blocked, but given what the purpose of the bot is, that really doesn't make it worse. You haven't lost anything in that scenario in terms of learning, because the bot hasn't lost any points, and it doesn't matter if you block it and get stuff, because you don't get points for throwing the bot just randomly after it does a move that brings it close to you. So you're still probably aiming to get in on it and throw. It's just the question of after what, or on reaction to what. And all of his mix-ups and so on are retained. So you don't have to worry about most of it. But as you know, and as you can already see, since most of what Ed does isn't really that relevant to this, he doesn't really need that to be one way or the other. And it's quite likely that in many situations the crouch medium kick will work just as well as the crouch heavy punch does. So this isn't really about, hey, this one is better for this type of character. You don't have to worry about changing EdBot for different characters that you feel like playing. This is mostly about understanding that he has this capacity, that when you're playing against him with different characters, he's more likely to do this just randomly in neutral do the enhanced snatcher. And as noted before, I didn't give him any combos. He probably has like one or two, but I didn't put any effort into this. He also doesn't have any combos specifically intended to use the V-Trigger 1, so you're not ruining him or taking out something important to the bot's functionality by doing that. If you turn on V-Trigger 2, he will still not damage you that much in that way. As that is functionally not his job. If anything, it's good at making you have to think about it so that you end up repositioning yourself properly. But for now, that's all we really care about. You can note that her version has... In fact, he even went straight into it there. Interesting. Her version tends to do the upward version of V-skill, which is the relatively easier version, but it doesn't really matter because Amara's evades a lot. So at the end of this match, we will switch over to the NashBot. Since I believe that was clear enough information on Ed to clarify what I didn't get to say. Well, did get to say but got cut off from, in case you didn't really want to watch that stream. So we're moving to Nash now. And this is mostly again because Nash was covered in that stream. So I just want to make sure that anything seen on that stream is clear enough. Mainly, I was more or less planning to show off Nash on my own stream tomorrow. But again, just covering a little bit of what was covered before, in case of confusions. So for Nash, you need to change the CA and V gauges to maximum start. This bot really basically requires those settings, so you can't mess with it too much. The V gauges on Amara's side are fine, so it's not an issue. So since your main point here is basically to do autopilot-y stuff, but let's focus primarily on the air-to-air stuff. And we will also be making use of the fact that my air-to-air reactions and air-to-air capacity on Chun-Li is higher than Ryu as a character in general. Ryu's air-to-airs are a bit more limited, and generally a player won't necessarily have air-to-air reactions if they're playing Ryu, because they would have spent their time focusing on things like Shoryuken timing and so on. So what will end up showing off is what happens when you are actually still learning this and how that interacts with the V-trigger. We're not going to worry about the rest of his systems for now, because those are all punishes. And punishes, if you have them right, the V-trigger of the character is unlikely to matter. But that sort of thing is likely to happen. If you don't air-to-air Nash correctly, he comes out on top, and it can change his rhythm. So as you get better and better at air-to-airing this bot, its behaviors change. This is also why it doesn't have the V-meter constantly. Because otherwise it might get eaten up in that sort of input and you really wouldn't have a lot of options there. But there's one, for example, because of how Nash's hurt bosses work in the air for his air moves, he was chosen for this specifically for that reason. Because he's the best bot at teaching you when your own air-to-airs don't work exactly as you intend or expect. Certain characters have really good air-to-airs and certain characters have far less effective air-to-airs than would be immediately obvious. And Nash is a good character to show you this, because of how his jump-ins work. As you can see, Nash is able to spend a lot of time on the ground being very confusing, repeating certain moves, etc. And making you very much less ready to do the air reaction. But one of the most important things is what he does when you land right next to him on the ground. In other words, what we're looking for is either the successful air-to-air or an attempt at an air-to-air and seeing what Nash does in those situations. You can see that with the current Sonic move, he has a strong tendency to go under you. For various reasons, actually. But he also can still do that sort of thing on Wake Up, and generally be tricky. So overall, the current version gives him a way to get to the other side of you, keep you mentally on edge, and force certain reactions based on that. Because as you can see, you also end up close enough to end up blocking that, and a lot of other little things. Understanding your options after air-to-airs is not a specific requirement of the bot. That's actually more so sort of related to Alex air reset stuff, but Nash does have some of it. At least in his easy version. But you can definitely see that when one is doing this on a character who does not have the best air-to-air stuff, you get a lot more recoveries. In Chun-Li's case, there is usually a recovery, but she's invincible almost exactly afterwards if you're pretty determined, or you can just turn it into a hard knockdown and solve your problem a lot of the time. Whereas it's just been demonstrated with Ryu, it's much harder to consistently be sure that you're going to turn it into a hard knockdown. I'll still demonstrate some stuff with Chun-Li tomorrow, but for the most part, I'm making sure that everyone understands the effect this has on a character who cannot assure the air target combo style thing. So now we're going to switch over, give him his other new V-trigger. Stealth Dash. Alright then. Could not remember the name of it. Now the problem with Stealth Dash is that it is an attack usually in itself. It doesn't have to be an attack, but it doesn't recover in ways that help when it isn't. He can do it more often as well, which is useful, but the end result is he's not generally going to get to the other side of you and then make an attack to make you tricked up. So a large part of the mix-up of he has jumped, you have done the air-to-air, landed together, and now we're looking to see what happens after that interaction. Some of that does go away. On the other hand, if you are past the easy part of the bot and are not particularly interested in learning that specific thing anymore, this is also a good V-trigger to use in that case, because the spacings that you end up standing at after punishes, especially if you're already waiting for jumps and so on, you get a lot more feelings of Nash trying to suddenly move in on you. I have no idea. It was reported to me that the stream had dropped. Maybe it glitched, maybe it didn't. In any case, once again as always, rebroadcast from Amara 2_MK to the main 2_MK channel, and we are proceeding to continue with the Nash part. Looks like we got a little cursed on this particular interaction. So as you can see in Ryu's case, Nash's stealth dash tends to, depending on the Ryu player's reactions, you actually have a lot of things you can safely do. Even though he still has the somersault shell and could hurt you, you can probably delay certain things quite long, resulting in him not having a lot of trouble there. Ryu, that is. The bot is capable of using almost all of Nash's options from Stealth Dash, including that cancel to get out of it. But just basically poking buttons on reaction, especially with Ryu, certain buttons are very good at dealing with it because they get you out of the way of the follow-up. And as you can see there, you can actually, depending on your character's hitbox for your air-to-air move, just do that on reaction as if he jumped. You might even get out of the way of the somersault version. I've seen this happen, not so much on Chun-Li, but Colleen can do it. And clearly, Ryu at least has a chance. So you can still learn a little bit of it, and since the bot is really not specifically about that, it's just a part of it that you're supposed to learn to do while doing everything else, you're usually fine. However, it is the timing for the bot that is most likely to have an effect based on the V trigger. As you can see, generally, unless you do knock Nash out of the air or get hit by his backhand, he generally just doesn't do his stealth dash. There's the other time he does it, after recovery of something where generally there wasn't that much to gain anyway. But the ones we care about, those are the ones we care about, basically. Because the rest of them are just weird interactions most of the time. In terms of learning to punish the move, it depends on a lot of factors, really. Your character may probably have specific ways of dealing with Nash getting that close to you, blocking after his stuff. It seems to be relatively minus, and therefore you get most of your options on the punish. But, as you can see there, your spacing might be a bit off. So you're really just looking for what reaches, and from there figure out how to move into whatever. The somersault is much easier to deal with. He basically puts himself right in front of you and you don't have to worry about it anymore. If you happen to get hit by the backhand, it's not really that different then. Overall, therefore, my suggestion is that if you spend time with this bot and you are focused on learning something like what to do after air-to-airs with your character, because your character does not have an air target combo and you need to have a ground response ready, you're learning your ground responses afterwards, for example. At that point, you care about whether he's using this V-trigger or the other. A little bit. Sonic move is more likely to confuse you, cross you up, give you other things to think about, remind you that, hey, other characters have weird options in this situation. And would probably help to prevent you from growing the bad habit of, okay, I can use this move all the time after this air reset at this height, blah blah. Because Nash does not have a lot of invincibility to show for that. And even some of his invincible moves, such as his throw invincible moves, have relatively slow startup, and you can partially option select between them and so on. However, if you're past that part and you're just working on general punishes, even though this move is effectively a combo extender and generally won't be taking you off guard, there is one situation in which practicing punishing it might be useful, even though it is relatively slow from the perspective of seeing it start until the end of the move. It doesn't take long for you to recognize that the move has happened. So the main thing you care about is situations like when you expected to be hit by it, but your opponent messed up and failed to hit you and you blocked in time. But even then, it's a fairly easy move to recognize, and all you would really have to do is recognize, oh wait, I blocked. But you generally have plenty of time to recognize that you blocked, because the hits either start early and go all the way through, or appear at the end. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest using this for anything. In fact, I don't really have any strong intention of building a NashBot 2.0 to try to take advantage of it, because again, it's mostly a combo extender move. It's not for mix-ups, it's not something that you need to understand probably too much. And there may eventually be someone who comes up with some way to use this for a meaty instead of an OTG, because the punch version of it does that. But I can't specifically see why, if they figure out a way to make it so that it's meaty, and that somehow affects you, so be it. Note, of course, that is not crush counterable. But I really have little more to say on the matter of that move. As a result, we can basically consider NashBot to stay the same. Either way, there may not be a NashBot 2.0 for quite a while given this. Especially since CPU Nash handles so many things well. You can probably try using CPU Nash with this, and we'll probably have some information on that if we consider it useful to the general community. But for now, let's move on to our most interesting character in terms of this, most changed in terms of V-trigger potential, and that being Dhalsim. Dhalsim's V-trigger changes are a relatively big deal.
This is the path to achieve enlightenment.
So, Dhalsim's situation for V-trigger stuff is massively different. There is no way to compare the two moves whatsoever. The player's gauges should be set to normal for various reasons. But Dhalsim's gauges are the same as for Nash in this case, auto recover on everything. So we have one point that actually is related to this, where you dash in and throw or command throw Dhalsim when he activates his V-trigger. Obviously that will be changing, and we will just make a note on DhalsimBot 1.0. But you can see that the main idea here, once he's put you in the flames, is that you have to figure out how to use your character's mobility options to get out. And if you can't do that easily, you should throw him, because you don't get burned while standing in flames while throwing. Now, the issue with DhalsimBot is that he really was designed around a character who basically doesn't have to worry about that. He doesn't have to do a bunch of complex stuff there. He just throws out the Yoga Burner and that's it. Everything else he does is more or less based on dealing with your attempts to get in on him, which is the same thing DhalsimBot is doing all the rest of the time anyway. So it's relatively easy to get the Yoga Burner concept into a bot, because it's just activate V-trigger. There's nothing else required to make the bot functional in terms of being able to use the V-trigger. He sometimes cancels into it, but that's it. Now the problem with his second V-trigger, which we will showcase soon but not immediately. The problem with the second V-trigger is that it requires him to use other moves to make it more useful. And he doesn't particularly cancel into it well. The way Yoga Burner works now is that it will even knock you down. If he does manage to clip you and cancel into it, he gets the knockdown and you must face that. And due to the way the character works in general, and the aim of the bot being basically to defend yourself and air to air, or anti-air depending, he generally won't do those moves in that situation. There are very few situations where DhalsimBot does the Flame Carpet Yoga Burner and then goes into any of the moves required to enhance or control that move. Namely the second V-trigger. Those who are not familiar, therefore, that's probably, what you saw there was probably the situation in which is the highest chance of it, where he happens to clip you with his heavy punch from far away, use the burner, and then for some reason you gave him enough time to then go into an entirely different action and use the Yoga Flame. But he's not guaranteed to use it, so there's really no guarantee at all that he can usefully use that V-trigger. And because he tends to only activate it on cancels, as with many of our other bots, you find a situation where he can't specifically get it done in neutral. You've just done the move and cancel from the heavy punch, but once the move is already active, once the V-trigger is already active, he just hits you with the heavy punch and does not in fact cancel into anything. In general, in fact, the character is not likely to do the V-trigger at all. His setup right now, which would therefore need to be either adjusted or rethought entirely, is that he mostly will only do Yoga Burner off a cancel. So you're not constantly sitting in Flame Carpet. That one's useful as well, but the reason that works has more to do with the timing of his aerial movement than anything else. He doesn't do the Flame Carpet because he happened to land and it was a good timing. He does it partially because he hit you with the sniping light punch from the air in the first place. So since it takes so long to get the data about whether or not he actually does the thing, we should probably switch now or it may never get seen. So we're looking for the same sort of situations, but when Dhalsim's very close to you, as you can see, it doesn't necessarily lead to anything, because it can just be blocked. It's a good move, and it actually knocks you down, I believe. It's very effective, but the primary thing you're learning to defend from with relation to this is not something the bot could easily do creatively in the first place, but it doesn't even get that far. It's just super unlikely to ever put this move to good use. And as you can see, as noted before, since he so often cancels out of it, it doesn't come up a lot. It does, however, provide a decent shield for certain things. Unfortunately, I can't really say that that teaches the player very much. He just puts it there and you can't really move near it. That's just it. So since he has this strong tendency to not really use it without cancels, which he cannot do on this part of it, see, there he basically could have had the, but does not actually do it. Although of course that is not a guaranteed thing, because that the heavy punch that he's using in that case is not the one we're talking about. His ability to cancel from that heavy punch is not because that is actually a command in the bot that the heavy punch always cancels. It's just that he has the capacity to. But of course, while he's in the heavy punch animation, it's still not going to happen. So you've gone from an already small chance to basically zero. And furthermore, his tendency to do Yoga Flames has a lot more to do with hitting you with stuff and getting into position to use it. The CPU, in fact, may be a better way to learn how to deal with this move from Dhalsim. So once we've investigated whether or not the CPU Dhalsim is capable of teaching you much about this move, then maybe we will decide whether or not to make a bot to try to have you deal with a bunch of stuff from this. Because he's basically not likely to do the Yoga Flame in a way that will cause that move to be activated before it fades on its own. And the fact that it fades on its own is probably the one thing limiting the bot's functionality relative to that move the most. The final result, therefore, is simply that technically, I would say that the easier way to deal with the bot, if you want to make the bot weaker, if you're having trouble dealing with its natural flow, is to change it to V-Trigger 2 so that you don't have to deal with being burnt in flame carpet. However, since part of the bot was entirely intended to make you learn it, it's probably not that great. But as you can see, that just doesn't last long enough for any high chance of Dhalsim actually using the Yoga Flame in time to empower the ball. And therefore, while it would be interesting to stay at this for quite some time, there's really no further benefit to showing off this at this time. The conclusion you should have is don't change his V-trigger when you're doing this and wait for DhalsimBot 2.0. If we are even going to build it. It's not a high priority, so please note that. So, since we're in the mental flow of, hey, how do I get in? Even though AbigailBot 2.0, which does already exist, is not specifically that, we are in fact going to take him on anyway. So, if not clear, the team does not all have the same AbigailBot, because the way that they fight Guile is different and the things they rely on are different. But the main reason why AbigailBot 2.0 is basically irrelevant in this way is that Guile doesn't actually activate his V-trigger. There's nothing in AbigailBot that causes his V-trigger to naturally be active. And the result of that is that only if you have made a change to one of his inputs will this even ever come up. That said, it is possible to have such an input. It's just super unlikely to ever mean anything. So we're just passing time with AbigailBot to verify and show off to you that it makes no difference whatsoever. If you were concerned at all, no, there's nothing. And as you will know, he doesn't naturally do flash kick. His entire purpose, there's the only time he will do that. He does flash kick after a jump in, effectively to end a combo. Well, this will have to be interestingly sliced together later. But, obviously, to give a splice point, once again, this content is rebroadcast from the Amara 2_MK channel to the main team's 2_MK channel with full permission. So, what are we looking for here? The input that this would be most usefully put into. The easiest way to modify AbigailBot 2.0 to have this, for those of you who have interest in doing it and testing it and seeing everything else, and for some reason AbigailBot 2.0 is your main way of dealing with Guile. In the interest of saving relative time on stream, I'm not going to explain or try to show off or do the input. It's probably not too difficult, but we have a tendency to try to get things really perfect before we give any less serious explanations. So here's the part that you need to understand. Currently, Action 4 is based on hitting a forward plus light punch, a jump, and then that 9 heavy kick that we keep on seeing. All you have to do is hit the trigger instead of the heavy kick in the air. That's it. Now, this is where Guile's flash kick comes from, so you do have to put some effort into getting it quote-unquote right. He will then activate it as part of a combo right there. For example, he will hit the punch and then go into his V trigger. But since he can't V trigger in the air, when he jumps he'll just normally hit that heavy kick as normal, because kick takes precedence in jumping inputs. If you jump and hit V trigger, he will in fact just do that. So we will change this a bit, but again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. We're just going to give you the raw version. So I will explain it first, so that you don't get the impression that whatever happens to come out, I mean, maybe if I have perfect execution it'll be fine, but you shouldn't assume that what you see is what is actually supposed to happen, because this probably needs tweaking and investigation and so on. But as a man who I will not name once said, let's do it live. So first of all, we will confirm that it's Action 4. Amara has different timing setups for some of these. Yes. So maybe 3 attempts, if that. You must find the max range that Guile's light punch will hit, and you're aiming to do that. But in this case, I need to do it with this button. So you get the idea. It's a jab, up, and that, but you're hitting it fairly late, as if you're trying to cross up. Specifically tells you that. So you can actually just jab and then immediately hold up forward. But if you've already activated the V trigger, you can see that the game actually asks a little odd about it. For all of you who thought that Guile's stuff was like relatively difficult to execute, no. It's difficult to understand and therefore difficult to come up with new things for, but yeah, I can just do that. honestly, I personally don't know why that works that way, and not many people have ever explained it. But this is your other option in case you weren't, in case for whatever reason you weren't aware that you don't actually have to have specific execution in terms of how you get out Guile's V-trigger. You can just hit forward V-trigger. Which in this case is useful to us because you actually have to hit this so late that he should be in the air already. And that's important. That's the idea. No, got it slightly off. So, but we can see the idea coming out really easily. Now note that because of various things in terms of block stun and so on, you can't not hit here. But that should be more or less correct. Now, where that takes us is a different matter. Guile now has the potential to activate his V-trigger at least somewhat. What does that do though? He's already throwing booms in very specific ways, but he doesn't normally hit a lot of buttons to do it. But he's not too terribly affected by my input, which is actually correct because he's not like... That input is relatively lenient. It's not supposed to be difficult. And in most situations, you won't actually see those crouching jabs. They should be primarily hidden. Because by the time he does them, he should already be in the air or something silly. And of course you'll note he still has the flash kick, but the specifics where he has it get complicated. But even in all that, doing it that way, it still doesn't make him likely to activate the V-trigger. So therefore I'm not suggesting at all that this is worth your time to make the upgrade for. The bot is definitely not built to make good use of the V-trigger 1. And even with that input, he's not too likely to enter the V-trigger state. So as you can see, despite this, unless you start to like punish the bullet knee really well and really often, you're not likely to get too much out of this, because he's not going to activate it most of the time. Especially since a lot of the timing that he already has is based around flows that don't help there. Now if you were to block for longer, well, hold down for longer, or get it perfect, it's more likely that rather than doing that standing jab, he would throw another sonic boom. But this still wouldn't change too much about the bot. Because as you will notice, he doesn't cancel now. He's not cancelling from that standing light into anything. He would have to hit with the third one. And I personally don't remember his booms being cancelable into this, but that is an option. If it is that he generally can cancel sonic boom into V-trigger, this will be affected more and he will be more likely to activate it. But even there you saw he hit with the standing jab and still basically didn't. The reason is because he takes so long to hit the V-trigger input after that standing jab that really nothing has happened. The standing jab got buffered into some other stuff so it prevents the jump, which is good, possibly. But you're not going to get a lot of V-trigger activation of this bot unless you start beating it up, involving a lot of reactions to stuff. Because he mostly doesn't do anything he can use to cancel it. The timing of that button is not going to work too well. There we go. There's something. But you'll also note that in almost all that time, he did nearly no flash kicks anyway. There's one. He proved me wrong. But because the bot is also basically not meant to spend a lot of time hitting punches in a way that would cause him to extend the V-trigger 1, you'll get those occasionally. Barely anything. So let's switch him over to V-trigger 2, since it's fairly obvious that this is not going to lead to too much. And honestly, this isn't either. If we can even get him to activate it, which is almost completely random at this point, the only thing that will happen is that when he does flash kick, it will be a little safer. If you want to learn the difference to punish his flash kick when it has that defensive thing in front of it, you can use the setup. If you're practicing against your GalBot anyway, you can figure out this is the way that I can gain from this. It's not a terrible thing to try to put in. It might occasionally come out and change the match a little bit for you. But I certainly wouldn't advertise it as a way to help you understand Gal's V-trigger 2, or use anything in his matchup really. So here we have active. Now the good thing about this move is that it really doesn't... It takes forever to run out. He has to flash kick basically for it to run out. But even then he takes so long to flash kick. And if you're playing on the regular version of this, you'll realize that obviously you could get hit before that even happens. It's literally more likely that unless you already mastered GalBot 2.0, he will probably defeat you before he even gets the flash kick off. There we go. So if he happens to flash kick from far away, then it shifts the way you can punish him. But if he flash kicks from right in front of you, you've already blocked the thing that would have protected him. And this bot is built to flash kick when it's right next to you, basically to prevent you from doing certain things or having certain reactions, or just to finish combos to give it at least a little bit of more real damage, because as it stands though, you could mostly just block the bot indefinitely. The only thing that would ever stop you is that you'd eventually not be able to get any points for the stuff you're supposed to do. So, my advice is, don't really get into this as a concept anyway. It's not worth your effort, it's not worth your thought. He's basically nearly never going to do anything with it. Would have to knock him down far away from you to see it even have an influence on this match. But on the other hand, since he's not designed to use it in the first place, it's not likely to come up. So generally you should expect, if Gal is knocked down at a very specific time and happens to have this active, you might get something. Beyond that, don't put your effort into it, don't put your time into it. If you find that input really easy to do perfectly, and you're not worried about being able to redo it as many times as it takes, because honestly, it's tricky if you don't understand charge character timings or cross-up timings very well, and depends on character, because you can make it so that Guile isn't able to do that sort of empty jump thing, and so on. But the general idea is that the bot doesn't need this, and adding it in doesn't really help you too much. So you don't need to put a lot of effort into making sure he can V-trigger at all, far less do this version. So we're going to give Guile a break and move to our next spot. So we're moving on to Abigail. And this is a totally different feeling, totally different experience. So Abigail is relatively interesting in his regular V-trigger state. Mainly, you're trying to jump in on him. The bot is totally different from the kata. But the main thing that he's trying to do with his V-trigger is put you in a situation where you must deal with his charged punches. However, there have been changes to Abigail as a character. Not a lot of them, but enough stuff related to Abigail Punch and some of his combos that you might care a little bit about the Season 3 AE changes, more so than the V-trigger changes. Most of those, however, have a lot more to do with the way Abigail gets damage after knockdowns, and therefore which knockdowns he gets and how it's relevant, than anything in this part. Now, since Abigail is designed in the opposite way to Dhalsim, where he activates his V-trigger, and then he has specific inputs that are intended to make use of the V-trigger. On the other hand, we have a V-trigger he has now where that's not the case, where he basically just activates it and holds it. Fortunately, depending on how you input it, which in the standard way, he should in fact be able to do the main thing that his V-trigger 2 allows, just because you were holding the buttons for V-trigger 1. But as a general reminder of what Abigail is trying to do with V-trigger 1 here, and why you don't see too much of it, is that we didn't put a lot of effort into making sure he could specifically do the charged punches. Because the main thing you have to understand about Abigail's charged punches isn't directly helpful to the matchup. If your opponent understands how to play their character at all, and understands you at all, they're going to find a way around anything you choose as a response to Abigail's stuff. He has unblockable setups, and you do have to understand them enough to try to either get out of them or recognize that you can't get out of them. But if your opponent is good, most of the time that's what you're dealing with. Understanding that you can't get out of them. So as you just saw, he will charge the punch, but he charges the crouching punch. And that's actually it. That's the entire concept of how Abigail works in this case. So we don't have to spend too much time on the V-Trigger 1 version because V-Trigger 1 is not the purpose of the bot. However, once I took a look at V-Trigger 2, which we will shift to now, I realized, possibly much to the chagrin of people out there who like just fighting regular Abigail, that the input we have given him activates his V-Trigger 2 in both of its forms. He has that where he will just activate it in neutral and do nothing in particular. And then it sits there. Unfortunately, he doesn't really use it that much, so he doesn't spend a lot of time going in and out of that V-Trigger and causing problems. But eventually, he will use it again. Provided you survive that long, of course. And the important thing to remember about that is, it is also unblockable. And that will happen. He does have better options after that than he has just demonstrated as well. Fortunately, it takes very long to charge up for this. But depending on your character, you may not be able to do too much about that. His armor is quite heavy. And he has a lot of active frames as just demonstrated, so just jumping out of the way simply doesn't really get you anywhere. Your best option for most characters, because he takes so long to recover from it, is to find a move that is either invincible or has a hurt box that moves out of the way upward very fast. But depending on your character, you may not have this option at all. Ryu is not very capable of dealing with this in that way, but Ryu is Ryu and Ryu doesn't care. Because Ryu never cares. Ryu, as long as Ryu can see a move coming, Ryu has no reason to fear the move, ever. That's his nature. Neither of us specialize in characters that can help you understand this, unfortunately. Because Amara basically can, with enough practice, just parry him out of it. And Chun-Li, if I'm really determined on it, I can just Rankyaku through it. She goes over it, she hits his armor, and never gets hit by his attack. Colleen, again, has basically both of those options really, so it never comes up for our characters, our main ones. Bison doesn't have easy ways around it, but it's the same thing, Devil Reverse, Teleport, any number of things of that nature. So it makes up for the fact that they don't have good buttons for getting out of the way instantly. Some people may need to do the Momochi level practice, however, and learn to counter the move with a throw on the way in. And if you consider this to be a part of the matchup that you want to understand, rest assured that Abigail is already capable of making you deal with that and making you understand the timing and to make you respond to it happening quickly enough without expecting much else going on. You could be having this regular fight where he's throwing out parries, hitting buttons in neutral, going into that, And eventually he'll just randomly, suddenly do the charge. And when he does, if you were training to be ready for it, then that's when you'd have to be able to respond with a throw. Command throw characters can easily do it because your feelings in terms of how to start that up is usually better. People who are used to grappling and solving their problems with throws can do it. Probably. But for Abigail, it's really just yet another way to deal with him because you're already learning from the kata, if you've moved on to the Abigail kata, to just throw him out of certain things. So while this will take some time to learn, you can always just add it to your regular training with the bot and understand that it needs to be done that way. That's odd. I thought it was 8 hits. We like specifically read up. Anyway, that's basically Amara's first attempt at doing that, and you get the idea. Ryu's not going to be too worried about it. However, there's really nothing to change, so I suggest that you just find whatever your character does and come up with your own response. You don't need to change the bot at all, and therefore I strongly suggest that if you are not already doing it, just change him to this and learn the timings and deal with it. It is 8 hits. So since no changes are required, and he has no specific goals in the bot that are related directly to dealing with V-Trigger 1, feel free to change it. There may be people who have setups that you need to understand, but most of the time, similar to the unblockable setup, it's not going to necessarily serve you too well at higher levels because he will do this to you after a knockdown with a big setup, and you might or might not be able to get out of it with an invincible move. So, my suggestion is actually, if you have a way to learn what your invincibility does versus the move, that might be your better option for the first couple tries. When you see him charge it up, instead of trying to actually counter it from full screen, since it's very likely that your opponent will do something very tricky to put you into the situation where you can't parry the move or deal with it. Like that. They'll be aiming to do it so that they get it on a knockdown, so you can't parry in time. Even Ryu has a parry that is not frame 1, so if they have it absolutely perfect, you won't be able to parry in time, period. So what you'd be looking for at that point is to see how your invincible moves interact with it, just in case you panic instead. Or if you happen to have a character whose invincible move somehow not necessarily beats it, because I don't think there are many that do, but that help you deal with the result of it, because sometimes when you can't avoid being hit, your general aim is to be hit in a way that you are not disadvantaged. So if you can wake up with a move that causes you to get knocked away in a particular way, take less damage, maybe there are a couple that probably do this, that'd be your aim. So in Amara's case, she has, for example, just EX Shoryuken, and maybe if she EX Shoryukens really early, he'll go completely under and nothing will happen. That sort of thing is what you're looking for. But that's just my general suggestion. But Amara being herself will just learn to parry that move and frustrate every Abigail ever. Because learning what exactly will happen when she wakes up with "Yeah, assure you" against it is something that you could learn in a match. I mean, if you're already set up, you might as well "Yeah, assure you," so that information will come up. Maybe in a tournament, you'd need to know beforehand. But there's not a lot of other options that Ryu has, so it's not really a big deal to him. So let's move on in the interest of getting to the end of the stream. We're going to go take a look at our ClawBot. Soon to be probably referred to as Vega by nearly everyone, much to the chagrin of many people in Japan. That's a long story. So, if I interchange between calling him VegaBot and ClawBot, that's just how we generally deal with this. Note that Nakali is probably not even going to be reviewed if it wasn't clear. He's vanished. Actually, I don't even remember where this character is normally. There we go. I just choose him automatically without thinking every time I need him. So for this bot specifically, Amara's gauges are already set to normal, but the bot's V gauge should also be set to normal. Now we could set it to max, and there is actually something useful there, but we'll go into that on another stream. Kanzaki Dynasty will probably show that off. The goals of the bot are fairly simple. Punish, air-to-air, anti-air, and some variation stuff, depending on what the bot precisely does. Now everyone's version of this bot is slightly different because it has a lot of variants. But as you can see, he's mostly about getting yourself into correct position and then punishing stuff. So Amara has the version that beats on zoners due to her general playstyle, and therefore you'll be seeing a lot of that sort of thing. Now, as probably noted before, this bot isn't really attempting to catch you with those wall dives, flying Barcelona attack. It's useful to have him do them so that you can learn to react. But the reaction in question is specific to the opponent, because that can be controlled in the air. The bot can also control it, but not particularly well, and it's a lot more related to where he is on the screen than anything else. I gave him a little variation, but it's generally not something you care about too much. But what you probably have noticed is that since he's a bot based around punishes, he builds up his V meter quite quickly because you're usually hitting him. And it's a 2-bar V trigger, so it's relatively easy to do that. Now the second thing that is fairly well known and easily learned is that if he hits you with the V trigger, he generally can't be punished. A few characters have some ways of reaching him in case the player decided to move, and a few of them can actually punish him. But most people just have to leave him alone, respect him in some way. Throwing the rolls and flying through you is not your chance to do damage. But that's a very binary thing to understand and learn. Someone can just tell you, hey, don't punish Vega stuff, figure out what to do instead. So if you've had practice with this bot, you probably understand this already. This character has had some changes that are relative to the bot, but they're not very large. There's a bunch of stuff about following that up with different things, but those ones aren't going to be seen very often, and the ones that are functional are mostly things that you shouldn't have been focusing on in the bot anyway. If you have I strongly suggest that the sort of things that changed in Vega for Season 3, if you have a Vega player, friend, or training partner, or go to a tournament, but of course, a lot of what we expect is that people who train with bots don't generally have time to go to a lot of tournaments. The general idea should be, the things that changed about him, the bot is not going to show you very well. Maybe some stuff with his role, and that's about it. So, while you can see some slight differences if you are very familiar with the character and already understand that based on interaction with some Vega player, don't expect the bot to do a lot of good in the relation to that. You're not going to get a lot of information from it. Especially since the inputs are relatively tricky and there's no way to be absolutely sure that your version of it helps. What you can see there is that he's likely to be pushed out further, so you can see some further out slides. Might be useful to make a note of one of these days, but I don't expect too much to come up. Why can you carry that low? Okay. So mostly, since most of us are conditioned to just ignore the rows, we find ourselves in the situation of, well, what happens if the bot doesn't do the rows? And we can shift to see that now. Now, his other V-trigger is a counter move. And the spacing that his V-trigger has in this bot is interesting primarily because there is no way to really usefully do it. The entire point of AbigailBot is that his rhythm in neutral is so complicated that you can never be absolutely sure what he will be doing or trying to do. All you can know is that occasionally he does a move and then could be punished, and that's the point of it. And since the main things you're trying to punish are his V skill and his stand heavy kick, there is one way in which this is helpful. If you're the sort of person that crouches under his stand heavy kick a lot and immediately attempts to hit a button because he does stand medium punch basically, and you decide, okay, I'm crouching, so I'm fine, I'm gonna hit a button now, I'm good. He is capable of countering at that moment, and if you hit your button too early, the result can be that rather than managing to punish the stand heavy kick that whips over your head, you get countered. This is a slightly useful thing to learn because if this happens to you a lot somehow, what it means is that you were never really punishing the stand heavy kick. You were paying attention to the bot's rhythm and taking advantage of it. Taking advantage of the fact that he has a tendency to do it in similar timings and places. And while this is a good skill to have, it's not that useful in terms of actually learning to respond to the move, because what you're responding to is the situation before that, and you're technically being slower. But in general, most of his moves that do recover slowly, he can't do the parry in time. This isn't necessarily because the bot is incapable of it, though. The bot does have the timings for the buttons such that he can do it. And if you get hit by the medium punch, it doesn't really matter because he'll generally go into the target combo, I think. And if he doesn't, he will cancel into it and be fine anyway. So you don't have to worry too much about the bot being ruined. At worst, it will do random stuff and then suddenly counter in neutral without it being a good idea. Like that. It'll clip you and then go instantly into the counter, giving you a free hit, but it's not a free hit you care about because it doesn't give you any points. It lets him waste out his V-trigger, and that's about it. However, since the way we functioned with the bot before was more or less that, he would waste his V-trigger, and that would be it. There are no real concerns there. We were never looking for him to specifically use his V-trigger very effectively. It's there to add damage and make you aware of it and cause problems. As he stands now, you will most likely see that move at times where he hits the stand medium punch, makes contact, and then counters. That's it. As I said, there are other uses to this. A particular form of training can be done. Once we've worked that out a little bit, Kanzaku Dynasty and I will probably make that clear. But you shouldn't expect him to counter after slide, for example. At least not very often. I think he can, but it's not likely to come up. However, as demonstrated, he can do it after the V-skill. And that may lead to you getting countered depending on your flow. But this is again a variant and only really matters if you put the V-skill in the second part of Action 3, which is mostly for zoners and so on. So if your Action 3 variant is not based on this, it's not going to come up. Note that Action 3's regular version is the skill version and is used for zoner characters: Nash, Dhalsim, Ryu, Ken, Manat, Guile, Boxer, Juri, Urian, Ed, Fang, Birdie. Now Zaku, I presume. Need to update that as well, obviously. Although I'm not really sure, I need to look into that. But you get the general idea. If this is what you are using for your concept of him, where you are punishing the V-skill, you may have situations where that happens to you. But that's it. So to close it out, we're moving on to the big boss himself. So, M. Bison, dictator to some of you. Maybe. M. Bison. Now, the concept of this character is mix-up defense. And since he has the capacity to use only his V gauge and not his CA gauge, so we're reversing what we had here. CA gauge to normal and V gauge to auto recover. We're looking for basic punishes and throw teching and stuff. Now, this bot is fast and generally terrifying. But there's no particular reason to perceive his V trigger as a big deal. He does have a V trigger input. But he also only has one of them. And he generally only cancels from his stand medium punch, which he also doesn't hit that often. He has no specific reason to hit his stand medium punch in most situations, but there you go. He cancels from his Psycho Burst as well, the medium Psycho Burst only. But again, he doesn't spend a lot of time using this functionality. He is very Bison-like though, obviously, on purpose. He doesn't spend a lot of time moving around. You can have long periods where he's just there crouching and you get that antsy feeling that you should do something. But you don't know whether or not it's time to do anything, because he could just not do stuff. But you do have to deal with most of his mix-ups as a result of this. Now the thing about the V-Trigger too, is that he loses most of these mix-ups. As for his other stuff though, the other changes he received, generally we didn't change that much about him. Well, they didn't change that much about him, and therefore we don't have to. The things that were changed are not things that you care too much about in the bot. And obviously, we are once again dealing with a character who doesn't really care. Ryu does not care about no mix-ups. At least not mix-ups that take that long to start. They have to arrive at different times. A left-right mix-up, an up-down mix-up, as long as they arrive on the same frame, Ryu doesn't care. In fact, quite literally, as long as he can open his eyes and have it work, he's fine. But the important thing about this character, relative to new V-Trigger stuff, is that his new V-Trigger has specific requirements for how it can or should be used. He is truly one of our most confusing bots to fight. Especially if you are used to Bison players. But when you have two Bison players available to design a bot, this is the sort of thing that happens to you. He also doesn't tend to waste this version of his V meter very much. But it's very hard to specifically point out how this has changed or would change. This is primarily because he doesn't have a lot of inputs that would get close to being the correct input for his command grab. And I would say that's probably the one thing we would change the most, and the thing most likely to hold him back in terms of bot stuff. His V-Trigger command grab, however, is not really the mix-up you care about. There's no information you need about this. Either it's probably grabbing you or it isn't. So, while we know that he's completely functional in this form, Let's move on to demonstrating his specific form of his functionality in the other form, because what happens is really interesting to watch. Note that you should not be expecting him to do anything related to command grabs. If he does, I'm almost certain it's a flute of some kind. Now his cancel should work exactly the same. He should generally do the V trigger at about the same times, but it now doesn't unlock a whole bunch of stuff for him. The only thing it unlocks is Psycho Crusher, which is basically a rapid movement across the screen. But because he doesn't tend to activate the V trigger raw, the question is generally, is it cancelable or not? The cancelability of Psycho Crusher is probably the part of this that makes the biggest difference to the bot, and opens up a lot of stuff that you need to understand in terms of hitting meaty and punishing. He decided not to show off his full power, namely, like, winning first, but here we go. So note that without that enhanced capacity, he doesn't get a lot of things. Therefore, the bot is much more linear and easier to understand. All of his Shin capacity is gone. He's in V-Trigger now, but his Devil Reverse is no longer enhanced. He can't get to the other side that way. You're not going to get a lot out of it. And due to his much smaller tendency to do anything related to that, what has mainly happened is this. Normally, Bison does Psycho Burst and cancels into V Trigger. Of course, you have to be standing close enough to him for this to matter. And none of the point systems of the bot involve specifically trying to get close to him in that particular way. Most of what this bot is about is teaching you to defend. So you get to stand over here and he won't do that much. But watch what happens when you start to tech the dash up throw stuff. Or when he does this and you don't actually respond. I would say that mostly he becomes more effective at punishing the player, not punishing in terms of hurting, but towards their goals. He makes it more obvious when the player is failing to get point C. When the player is failing to respond to his somersault, devil reverse, all of those things. But since he has less mix-ups with those things, that's a different matter altogether. It's a bit of a trade-off overall. But you can see there that he does have moments where he can just hit his stand medium punch. They're just not often. But here's where it becomes vitally important. Once he has you in the corner, different things start to happen. Which is why, obviously, your aim is to throw him. Your aim is to throw him and get yourself out of the corner. So the better you perform at those things, the less you're going to see any change whatsoever. Therefore, your main concept is scramble situations and how those scramble situations are changed by his new V-trigger. Because the previous V-trigger didn't really change scrambles, it changed his pressure, it changed the way he moved toward you. But when this one happens to be active, it is far more about scrambles have changed and now you need to deal with that. There's a good example, obviously. It's not something you see too often, but he can use that to make his slide safe. Just slide into Cycle Crusher, basically it. The important thing, therefore, that you can use that for is making sure that you know how to deal with his spacing afterwards once he does that. However, since that is not his necessarily natural response either, don't expect to see it too much. So here we have the situation as mentioned before, cornered, and he'll push you back there if you give him the time. But he also back throws you out of the corner if you fail. But now for the final check on this bot, we're going to give him his full CA meter. Because there is a version of the bot in which you do this. And so far our findings have been that this is probably the best way to use V-Trigger 2. If you're giving the bot V-Trigger 2, you should probably also give him full CA gauge. Because since he loses so many of his mix-ups, and we are assuming that by that time you have already dealt with everything else because this is the extreme version, you know how to deal with most of his stuff. So what you want is to give him this, so he can move about a lot more freely, and force you to deal with him at much more ranges, and increase his ability to push you into the corner. Once all of those things are done, then you have to worry a lot more about the Cycle Crusher when it does trigger. And since this entire feeling increases the amount of time you spend thinking that he can get close to you very quickly, you're far more likely to worry about this sort of thing. Unless you're Ryu, of course. But the overall flow of the bot is, as noted, unchanged. Just have to get used to a ton of more bites and stuff. However, it is also true that he will most likely activate his V-trigger less often, because he spends more time in extra movement states and is harder for you to counter or put back down. So he becomes much more likely to only activate his V-trigger when one of those things has occurred. Overall, however, we don't suggest doing a whole bunch of stuff relative to his V-trigger stuff. We will probably just provide DictatorBot 2 and have you deal with it that way. However, as you can also see, since he does have a variation he can use, and he doesn't really require his V-trigger to do a good job as a bot, he is also relatively lower priority in terms of our development. So you can continue to use him to get used to just that, oh hey, we're going through. So that's it for now. Brings us to the end of our stream. Tomorrow, I'll be back to give you the finals with Colleen, Chun-Li, probably some rehash of Nash, and Zeku. And if not tomorrow, Wednesday will be seen then. So for now, thank you everyone for watching, and good night.